Okay, so welcome everyone, and especially hi Ross. Thank you for taking the time for this webinar. This is going to be hopefully a webinar series about AI first science. We call AI first science everything that puts artificial intelligence in the center of redefining how science should be done, and Ross is a forerunner in this space because he has been talking about this specifically, automation of science, much longer than LLMs came around and everyone started to talk about this. So that's why I'm really happy that you have accepted this invitation and would share your thoughts with us. So the process is going to be that Ross would give us a presentation and then we can ask questions about whatever, no, I guess not whatever, but related to AI for science, whatever we like. So Ross, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me try and share my slides.
Hopefully. Fantastic. We see that.
Let me. Can you see that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, it'd be nice to actually visit Budapest, actually, rather than visit Budapest virtually. That's a nice place. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is the automation of scientific research. Okay, so first the big picture. So the scientific method was invented in once in history in 17th century Europe, and it has literally transformed the world. You know, it's the invention of science is up there with the discovery of fire and the invention of agriculture. It's one of the big things in human history. Thanks to technology based on science, billions of people now have better lives, better standard of living than emperors and kings did in the 17th century. You know, we have better food. I, for breakfast, have a range of products from around the world, which are far more nutritious and healthy and tasty than 17th century food. I have access to far, far better medical care. I would have hated to see, for instance, a 17th century dentist. That was very scary. I have in my pocket a device which that allows me to communicate with billions of people around the world. This morning I flew from Sweden to Britain in a plane. You know, it would take weeks of travel in the 17th century. So I think it's worthwhile taking a step back and realizing how amazing this achievement is. Actually, you know, we've managed to give billions of people this fantastic standard of living compared to how people lived in the past. And I don't think most people on the streets and our political leadership appreciate what's actually happened. They seem to think that things have always been like this. It's not true. Look at history. However, at the 21st century, we face huge challenges. You know, we have food insecurity. Roughly about 1 billion people still have food insecurity and live in poverty. We have pandemics. We have climate change. We have cancer is still killing about a third of human beings. And to make these challenges, how to deal with them, I think we need better science and technology. I don't believe that there is any political hope of a solution. So I think if all the countries in the world got together and shared resources and technology fairly, then I think people in the West their standard of living go down, but the whole world would have a slightly much better standard of living than it. You know, we could deal with the world's problems. But I see no hope of a political solution to the world's problems at the moment. The world's not going to get together and suddenly behave nicely to each other. the political situation is actually getting worse and worse, you know. So I think the only hope to meet these challenges is to make science more efficient, and the only way to do that is through the AI. It's not a new idea to apply AI to science. It goes back to the 70s in California, in Stanford, in the dendril and metadendril projects. The application area was mass spectrometry data, and it was to do with the Viking probes to Mars. They were, back in the 70s, looking for life on Mars. And Mars is very far away, and so you wanted to make the sort of scientific research there autonomous. That was the key idea. In fact, as a child, I remember NASA announced that they had found life on Mars. You know, they had taken some Martian soil, added water, and the mass spec suggested that there was some life there. NASA quite quickly retracted that claim, but it's still debated what actually happened in that experiment. But the project was led by a guy called Joshua Lederberg. He got the Nobel Prize for medicine for the discovery of essentially sex and bacteria, which has transformed biotechnology. But after he got the Nobel Prize, he taught himself to program back in the 1970s and was interested in the philosophy of science and became very interested in using AI to automate science. The chief scientist on this project, apart from Joshua, was this guy called, the chief computer scientist was a guy called Ed Feigenbaum. He's still alive, and I met up with him a couple of years ago. He got the Turing Award, which is like the Nobel Prize for computer science, for his work on expert systems. Bruce Buchanan was a founder of machine learning as well, and Carl Djerassi, who's unfortunately now dead, he should have got the Nobel Prize for chemistry. He was the main person behind the birth control pill, but he was the chemist in the project, the mass spec guy. So yeah, so the application of AI to science goes back at least 50 years. And AI systems now have superhuman scientific powers. You know, they can remember everything. You know, flawlessly remember vast numbers of facts. AI systems can do flawless logical reasoning. Human beings can't do that. They can do near optimal probabilistic reasoning. So if you have a small amount of data, an AI system can analyze it better than any human. They can also learn from vast amounts of data, literally the whole internet. You know, large language models are trained of all the text on the internet. No human being can even dream of doing that. They can read millions. In fact, they can read the whole scientific literature, and the large language models have literally read the literature thousands of times. So these are superhuman scientific powers which are complementary to human scientists. And science actually is a very well-suited task for AI. It is abstract, like, you know, the games of chess and Go where AI has triumphed, but involves the real world, which is much more important in games. And scientific problems are restricted in scope. So that means that if you want to do science, you don't need to know about vegetables or politics or anything like that. You just need to know about science. And that makes the reasoning much, much easier. You just have to focus on the actual, what is known about that particular area of science. Another advantage is that nature is honest. By that, I mean that if a human or a robot is doing a scientific experiment, we're convinced that the real world isn't trying to systematically mislead us how the world works. You know, so you do an experiment, you may misinterpret the results of the experiment, but we're pretty sure that the real world isn't trying to trick us of what's happening. And that's quite different from, say, economic games where many of the actors are cheating and lying, or military games where you can't trust what you what information you receive. That makes the reasoning much, much easier in science than in some other application areas. Another thing is that I would argue that nature is a worthy object of our study. So traditionally, in fact, most of machine learning and neural networks and large language models and things has been driven by advertising revenue. And for the young people listening here, you know, when you're looking to do what you want to do in your life and your career, do you want to look back on your life working for a large American corporation, optimizing advertising sell things to people they don't really want. Is that what you want to do? Or do you want to do something, purposeful in your life? And I would argue that you should do something purposeful. Think about your soul. And I'd argue that the generation of scientific knowledge is a public good, at least if that knowledge is in the public domain. So my contribution to this is the concept of a robot scientist. Sometimes it's called an AI scientist now, or self-driving lab. And the basic idea is that you want to build an AI robotic system that can autonomously do scientific research. So a robot scientist has background knowledge about an area of science. That knowledge can be in logic or probabilities, or perhaps it's encoded in a large neural network. The robot scientist can then autonomously form novel hypotheses about that area of science. It can generate new ideas, which can then be tested in experiments, and the robot scientists can autonomously decide on efficient experiments to test the hypotheses. So these are efficient in terms of time and money, which are the major constraints which scientists face. The robot scientists can then program laboratory automation systems to actually execute the experiment. They can then look at the results of the experiment and work out what they mean in terms of the probabilities of the hypothesis. If the experiment is consistent with the hypothesis, the probability of the hypothesis goes up. And conversely, if the experiment is not consistent, then the probability of the hypothesis goes down. And then the cycle can be repeated. So that's the basic idea. We're trying to build a machine that can do scientific research on its own. And the original motivation for this was from the philosophy of science. I was interested in trying to understand what exactly is science. And the idea is that if you can make a machine that does scientific research, then you understand something about science. So that is what's called an operational approach to the philosophy of science. Building a machine will help you understand the subject, just like one of the traditional motivations for AI was to try to understand the human mind. If we can build AI systems which are intelligent, that'll tell us something about the human mind. Building machines that do science will tell us about science. And this is Richard Feynman's blackboard at the time of his death. And you can read there just about, it says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So it has the same operational approach to understanding things. Try to build a machine. The other motivation is to increase, that's the one I mentioned at the start, to increase the productivity of science. So robot scientists can work cheaper, faster, more accurately and longer than human beings. And they can also be more easily multiplied. So once you have a working robot scientist, you can make more of them very quickly. Whereas it takes 20, 25 years to grow another human scientist. And I think an increasingly important other motivation is the quality of the science that robots can do can in many circumstances be better than for humans, especially when it comes to reproducibility, because a robot scientist can describe the experiments in far greater detail, in semantic detail, than a human being. So they know the motivation for the experiment. They know if a conclusion has been made, they can see all the evidence that's gone into that conclusion. And that's quite different from human scientists. And one of the problems in science at the moment, especially in certain areas like psychology and biomedicine, is the lack of reproducibility of experiments. So even in top journals like Nature and Science, roughly about half of the papers that are published there, they cannot be replicated in other people's labs. And that's not due to scientific misconduct, it's just because they haven't described the experiments in sufficient detail. Especially if you're dealing with living systems, they're very, very delicate. So you need to nail down completely all the conditions in the experiment. If you don't do that, the results can't be replicated somewhere else. And robots really help this to happen. So I've been working on this for a long time, 25 years. The first work was we showed that the different parts of the cycle could be automated, but the laboratory automation is very simple, and the results they weren't novel results. They just rediscovered some known knowledge. We then worked on the Adam system, which I'll talk about in some detail. It was, we argue, the first machine to automatically discover some novel scientific knowledge. We developed then the Eve system, which applying it to tropical diseases. I'll talk about that as well. Eve is most of the self-driving labs, AI scientists are basically copies of Eve. In some ways, actually, Adam was more sophisticated. And I'm working on the system Genesis. So this is a picture of the robot Adam. Adam was applied to a particular biological problem. It's called functional genomics. That's trying to understand the function of genes in living systems. The model, the organism we used is the model organism called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's a type of yeast. This is the yeast that is used to make bread and wine and beer, whiskey. But in biology, it's used as what the biologists call a model system. It's a model for the human cell. And even though the last common ancestor of yeast and humans was roughly about 1 billion years ago, biology is very conservative, and yeast cells work in basically the same way as human cells do. So it's like the design has been conserved over 1 billion years. So and it's much easier to work with yeast than human cells because they're simpler and they're much easier to grow. And back in 1997, yeast was first sequenced. It is the first eukaryotic system to be sequenced. Human cells are eukaryotes, plants are eukaryotes. All eukaryotes are basically, and that core design have the same design. But to this day, 15% of the 6,000 genes we still don't know their function. And one way to tackle finding out the function is what's called deletant mutant. So you take the system, 6,000 genes, and you remove one of them. And you look to see if the system is different after doing that. And so if you imagine you wanted to understand how a car works, you remove the steering wheel. If the car, then you notice the car doesn't steer, then you infer that the steering wheel is to do with steering. That's the logic the biologists are using. Yes? And that's the logic which Adam used to infer the functions. Before I talk a bit more about that, I want to talk about some really basic things about logical inference, which even quite experienced people in AI don't know nowadays. This is, yeah. So the first type of logical inference is what is called deduction. This is the basis of mathematics and computer science. When a computer program executes, basically it's just doing deduction. When you're doing mathematics, you have a set of axioms, you have a set of rules of inference, deductive rules, and you infer new things from the axioms. So here's an example of deduction. You have a rule, all swans are white. You have a fact that Daffy is a swan. Therefore, you infer deductively that Daffy is white. Okay. And the beautiful thing about this of deduction is that if the rule is true and the fact is true, you can only infer new truths. So it's truth preserving. So that's why it's used in mathematics. If the axioms are true and your rules of inference are true, then you can only infer new truths. Yeah. It's a wonderful property. Unfortunately, it's insufficient to do science. In science, you need to have some way of inferring some new ideas. And one such approach is called abduction. And here's an example. You have a rule. All swans are white. You have a fact that Daffy is white. Then you can infer abductively that Daffy is a swan. Okay. And the thing to notice here is that this is not necessarily true. Yes. But it's one way of inferring a hypothesis about Daffy. I don't know if anyone in the audience reads Sherlock Holmes, but if you do, in fact, you should, because the stories are really fun and good. But if you do, Sherlock Holmes often says that he deduced that the murderer was the butler because of the footprints in the library and things like that. He's technically incorrect. What he's doing there is abduction. He's inferring a cause from a result, yeah, rather than a result from a cause. Yeah. Okay. The second way of generating new ideas in science is called induction. This is when you're doing machine learning, that's basically induction. You're generalizing. So here's an example. Daffy is a swan in white. You have another fact that Tweety is a swan in white. Then you infer inductively that all swans are white. Okay. So you're generalizing. That's what machine learning is. This is also not guaranteed to be true. You know, the example of all swans being white goes back to Aristotle 2,500 years ago. And Aristotle actually invented deduction. At least that's what he claims, and it seems like historically to be the case. But this example of all swans being white goes back to Aristotle. It was taught in European universities for 1,000 years. But when explorers got to Australia, they found the swans are black there. So there's a traditional problem in philosophy called the problem of induction. Why should you believe these generalizations? Yeah. Why should you believe that the sun will rise tomorrow? Why should you believe that your breakfast will not poison you? I first came across this in a book called The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. And in that book, he told about the story of the chicken. You know, every morning, the farmer came to the chicken and fed him. Fed her, I suppose. And the chicken inferred that the farmer was a nice man. The chicken was wrong. So one morning, the farmer came and wrung the chicken's neck and ate her. So you need to think, are you like that chicken? What are you assuming is going to be the same in the future? And a lot of things have happened recently which have shown that I've been quite chicken-like. A lot of things have changed which I did not expect to change. You know, you need to be flexible in your reasoning. Yes, Daffy's a duck. I wrote about this in an article in Scientific American, and I wanted to use the example of Daffy and Tweety and things like that in the article, but they wouldn't let me because they said this is all intellectual property of Warner Brothers. You know, I'm in copyright problems here. Okay, for Adam, we needed to formalize the problem. We did this. You know, if a computer is going to do all of science, we need to actually formalize it, make it completely formal. So we represented the background knowledge using logic programming. That's where you use logic as a programming language. We modeled metabolism. So metabolism is how a yeast converts its food, which is basically sugar and minerals, into more yeast. So we modeled that as a directed labeled hypergraph. We used abduction, not induction, to infer new hypotheses. That is typical for biology. Most biologists are filling in facts in the world of biology rather than forming generalized rules. We used active learning to decide on efficient experiments. Active learning is the branch of machine learning where the machine learning system gets to choose its next example. And there's a very close relationship between active learning and the scientific method. And we use a lot of machine learning to decide the meaning of experimental results, because if you read the philosophy of science, philosophers seem to have always thought that experimental results were sort of clear. That is very rarely the case. You know, it's most times if you're doing science, it's not completely clear at all what the experimental results mean. Yes, so to infer hypotheses, we used so science is basically how science works is you infer a hypothesis and you deduce the consequences of that hypothesis and you test whether these consequences actually occur in experiments or not. Yes, that's called hypothetical deductive method. Yeah. And traditionally in the philosophy of science, forming the hypothesis is supposed to be the hard part. These leaps of imagination, you know, Archimedes' Eureka in the bath and things like that. Yeah. And as I said, most hypothesis generation is abductive, not inductive. How we program this in Adams, we use abductive inference to fill in missing arcs and labels in its graph. These are the hypotheses. They're saying this particular gene has this particular function. And once you've made that hypothesis, then you can use deduction to infer what will happen in the experiment. So Adam generated and confirmed novel functional hypotheses about the identity of genes encoding enzymes in yeast. We then went back into the lab and did the gold standard experiments to confirm that these hypotheses were and conclusions were correct. And to do that, you purify the gene product, and then show it has the enzymatic function you predict. And so we claim that Adam was the first machine to autonomously discover novel scientific knowledge. It both hypothesized some new knowledge and experimentally confirmed it. Our second robot scientist was called Eve. It was designed to apply the same idea to something of more societal value in drug design, early stage drug design, specifically for neglected tropical diseases. So malaria is it kills about 500,000 people a year, mostly babies in Africa. It infects hundreds of millions of people every year. It's quite debilitating when you're infected. I was in Kenya a few years ago and I was asking people, have you had malaria? And they said, of course, we get it every few years. So it's not just people dying, it's also the disease burden on the community. Schistosomiasis kills tens of thousands of people and infects hundreds of millions of people. It's a horrible worm that infects people around the world. I have an ongoing project in Leishmania in Brazil. One of the shocking things about that project is that the funding for the project comes from rich Brazilians who are worried about their dog getting Leishmania, not their poor Brazilian citizens. It is deeply shocking. And Chagas disease kills tens of thousands of people as well. This is what Darwin probably had. So yes, these are called neglected tropical diseases because they're neglected by the big pharmaceutical companies. They will not develop drugs against them because they don't think it's profitable to do so, which is also deeply shocking and immoral. One of the things actually would make it quite easy for the pharmaceutical industry to work on these is that it's quite clear what to do to treat the disease. If you want to cure these diseases, you just kill the parasite and not kill the human. So it's quite clear. And that's quite different from many diseases which the pharmaceutical industry does tackle. If you want to cure cancer, you need to kill the cancer and not patient. And that's very difficult to do because the cancer was the patient only a year ago or something like that. So they're almost identical genetically. And, if you want to cure people of diabetes type 2, we know it's something to do with sugar metabolism and imbalance, but how do you treat that with a single drug? It's very far from clear. But for these diseases, it is very clear. So we formalized the problem. We used graphs and standard chemoinformatics methods to represent the background knowledge. We used induction, not abduction this time, to learn quantitative structure-activity relationships. So these are little machine learning models where if you put in the structure of a small molecule, it will output the predicted activity. Okay. And we used active learning to decide on efficient experiments. Okay, see if we can, this is Eve running in my lab in Sweden. So Eve is quite a typical piece of laboratory automation. If you go to any wet biology lab, you'll see similar things. Though probably not in this amount of integration together in one piece. The actual individual pieces are quite typical, but not quite the integration. So Eve is about 5 meters by 3 meters by 2 meters. The robot arm is picking up what's called a microtiter plate. It's got 384 little vessels which you can do experiments in. Each one can hold about 50 million yeast cells. So Eve is doing an experiment here to test this QSAR model. Is putting it from the incubator into a plate reader, which will measure how much growth has happened. and whether the compound has managed to inhibit the growth. Okay, what we wanted to do was to show that the traditional way of doing drug design, early stage drug design, was you would make an assay, and then you take a library of compounds, maybe 1 or several million compounds, and use laboratory automation to test all the compounds. You'd start at the beginning, continue to the end, and stop. And the idea of Eve was that once you've seen the results of a few compounds, you can use machine learning to make a QSAR and then use active learning to choose compounds cleverly than just testing them all. And we wanted to show this was economically rational, that you could save money. And if you look at this graph on the right, you can see that all the bits of it were blue. So we make it a model of the actual costs involved in drug screening. And all this place, which is blue and green, it's rational to use AI to do drug screening. And this has now been adopted by the pharmaceutical industry, because you save time and you save compounds, which is both money. I'm now working on a new system called Genesis. And the application area is biological systems. And even the simple model systems are like yeast and E. coli are incredibly complicated. They have thousands of genes, proteins, small molecules, all interacting in complicated temporal spatial ways. They're really complicated little systems. And on top of that, Occam's razor doesn't work very well. So Occam's razor is the idea that you should choose the simplest explanation is most likely. That doesn't work very well in biology, unlike in physics, because these biological systems have evolved over roughly 3 billion years. So there are many features in them which were there because of something happened, maybe 1 billion years ago. So they're not rationally designed like a human would design them, which makes it much harder to untangle how they work. And I would argue there are not enough PhD biologists in the world to disentangle these systems anytime soon. And on top of that, our models, because they have all this complexity of the thousands of genes, proteins and things, are beyond human intuitive understanding. We need help from robot scientists, I would argue. Yes, so Genesis is tackling eukaryotic systems biology, trying to make models of eukaryotic cells. If you remember, yeast is a eukaryotic cell, as are you and plants. The idea is that the hardware will execute 1,000 closed-loop cycles of experiments in parallel. So we're going to have what's called 1,000 little chemostats, which are continuous flow vessels. And the really hard part will be the AI system, which will sit on top of all this and decide on which experiments to do next. So it'll plan 1,000 experiments in parallel every day. That's the idea. And that will control the design, plan, execution of them. And each experiment will be designed to test a hypothesis about how yeast works. So yes, the 1,000 little microchemostats. So a chemostat is a continuous flow vessel where if you do the maths, you're putting in growth media and taking out growth media at a steady rate. And the math shows that controls the growth rate of the microorganism, because that's the only, if the microorganism grows faster, it gets washed out faster. So that's the only steady state is the flow rate. And that's very useful for understanding how systems work, because you know what the actual growth rate is. You can see it's very complicated to have 1,000 chemostats, and we've been working for a number of years and trying to get the hardware to work properly. There's lots of, it's not so much microfluidics as it was little mesofluidics. We're talking about sort of milliliters of fluids. The really hard part is the Genesis AI part. We're trying to model this. The model has thousands of components. We need to understand how they interact, not just metabolism, but signaling and genes and things like that. We're going to have, over the period of time, millions of hypotheses, results and experiments. We've had to design special databases to hold all that inference. We need special machine learning techniques to not just fix parameters, but also restructure these models, which is very hard for even the most impressive deep learning model. We need experiment planning. The idea is to have an agent for every gene, protein, and smaller molecule. And on top of that, we need some way of dividing up the resources. So we're going to have like a virtual research council sitting on top of everything. That's the idea. And unlike real research councils, we hope this system will learn from its mistakes, which is doesn't always happen in the real world. It probably doesn't remain in Hungary, I'm sure. Okay, we're looking forward. So the goal of science is to increase our knowledge of the natural world through the performance of experiments. I believe very strongly this knowledge should be expressed in formal logical languages, because only formal languages promote the semantic clarity which is necessary to support the exchange of scientific knowledge between humans and between humans and robots. I don't think having black box neural networks doing science is the real goal of it. We need to have our knowledge of science in some formal language, whether that's mathematics or something like predicate logic, something like that. Okay, here's a potted history of AI. In the beginning, AI systems were based on logical inference. In the 1980s, which I'm old enough to remember, AI was dominated by expert systems. So what they did was add to logic a formalized knowledge about a problem area. And in many ways, these expert systems were wonderful and beautiful systems. They could execute many tasks which human experts were required to do. And you could see the reasoning. Everything was clear. You said, why did you decide this patient had this disease? You get a complete explanation. There was no hallucinations like you get in modern modern AI systems. However, the expert system project failed, and it failed mostly because of the knowledge acquisition bottleneck. We couldn't get the knowledge into the system. We couldn't ask human experts, because if you ask an expert a doctor why they think this patient had this disease, they don't know. They have no access to their own internal thoughts. And all that knowledge is out in the natural language, in books and papers and things. But machine learning and AI, we couldn't deal with natural language back in the 80s. And the final nail in the coffin was actually a previous rise of neural networks back in the late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, the neural network community boasted and bragged that they could do all the things that they actually do now. But at the time, they completely failed. But they managed to take all the money out of expert systems. It was because they failed. That's why they went into for about 25 years, no one funded neural networks. Not because they're intrinsically a bad idea, but because they had promised too much and they had failed. Okay, so in the scientific literature, there's roughly, 100, 200 million papers published, and they literally have the stored wisdom of humankind. However, we can't access that knowledge at the moment very easily. Humans can read it and understand it, but we can only read a few papers a day. And we can't cross-check it with access knowledge. The modern way to deal with this is to ask a large language model what's in the literature. However, it may hallucinate and not tell you the truth. So it's hard to get the power of the large language model and the reliability and trustworthiness. But what they do amazingly is that they do a remarkably good job of extracting formalized knowledge from natural language texts. So if you remember, I said back in the 80s, we couldn't do this. We had no way of doing it. Now we can do that, which is amazing. They solved what's called the predicate invention problems. They can invent basically programs. They can automatically program things. Yeah. And once knowledge is formalized, it can be checked for correctness and truth. You can check whether a statement is correct or not. You can even do an experiment. You can program a robot to find out. So for the first time in human history, we can generate certified knowledge at scale. And I think this is a feature of our new generation of AI systems with trusted intelligence. So this is my vision. I want to formalize the scientific literature, get it out of scientific papers into a formalized form. And this will also have the advantage of, so one of the other, the scientific literature is dominated by rich publishers like Elsevier and Springer, Nature, and they basically screw scientists. They take our ideas, we do the editing, and then they sell it back to us. It's crazy. But if we can formalize the knowledge, have everything that's important in the papers in a formal form, then these Springer Verlag, Elsevier no longer own the copyright. This just breaks it. They don't have the copyright on the knowledge, they only have copyright on the text. So this would be one way of getting around their stranglehold of the scientific literature. I've been working on this idea for a long time. This is back about 20 years ago. I tried to formalize by hand an issue of Nature. I only managed 2 papers, one about the mass of the top quark, another one on these cute animals called solenodons. This is what the sort of formalized knowledge looks like in a logical language. One thing that was very interesting actually was, the paper on top quark had 300 physicist authors. And when you look not too closely at it, and you try to formalize it, you could see that it was a piece of rubbish. It should never have been published in Nature. What it did was it took from the Fermi lab near Chicago, where they actually discovered the top quark. It took some old data, threw away the bits of the data they didn't want, and then reanalyzed the data to get the result they wanted. And that's got published in Nature. It should have been shocking. They had the mass of the top quark they published in that paper was all wrong. And we now know the top quark's mass is back to what it was pretty much before that paper. I think if the people had access to a formalized form of that paper, then they would have realized it wasn't a good paper. The biology paper was a nice one. So I want to formalize the scientific literature and supercharge robot scientists. Let me say a little bit about large language models. They're really impressive. I never expected to see anything like that so quickly. I assumed anything that clever would have an internal model of the world. They don't have that. They don't even have a body. I assumed something that clever would have to have a body and learn through bumping into things. They don't do that. They have they don't have a concept of truth or probability. But they can also be impressively stupid. And you can't inspect how they work. So if you ask most people in the world, all these top companies, OpenAI, people like that, they're literally investing $1 trillion in this idea, trying to make them smarter. And how to get them smarter, they think it's just more training data and better logical inference benchmarks. I don't think that's possible. I think the architecture precludes making them really smart. So this is how it happens at the moment. If you go in your so-called large reasoning models, they have wrappers around LLMs, and all works together in a complicated, hacky way, and you may get the answer out at the end. This is what we call in Britain technically a dog's dinner. It's like a mess. It's not something you want to eat. I come from a tradition of logic. Been studied for 2,500 years. We know it works, and reasoning can be queried. So I think the way forward is some sort of hybrid. So we know human intelligence has 2 main components. It's got the fast perceptual intuitive one, like for you can do image analysis, and there's a slower logical planning part, which your consciousness has a lot more say in. And so there's a famous book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and I think there's a mapping between large language models and foundation models, things like that, with thinking fast and thinking slow and logical reasoning. I don't think you should try to get the large language models to do logical reasoning, because we already know how to do that. I think these systems are complementary. Expert systems are brittle. So if you ask them a question outside of their expertise, they can't answer it. But when they can answer things, you get a nice answer which is inspectable and trustworthy. Contrary, large language models, you can't check them for corrects, but they're incredibly flexible. So yes, I look forward to some sort of hybrid system. And to finish off, I want to talk about the future of AI for science. People should look up the Stockholm Declaration on AI for Science. Basically, it's saying we should use AI only for good. So I'm interested in trying to promote a prize for science. Maybe this is something which HUN-REN can help with for the Hungarian government. I would like a prize to rival the Nobel Prizes, but this time for robots doing science. So it'd be an annual prize for the most important scientific discovery made autonomously by an AI system. I don't think I'd need too much money, just need prize money of about $1 million a year or something like that. Something to think about if you know any billionaires or rich governments. I've asked a few billionaires actually. It was what's his name? Who was the guy that was in Google?
Larry Page?
Not the two founders. The guy that was running it.
Running it?
Sorry?
Is it who? I'm not sure.
Who was the guy that was the CEO for years? Anyway, I got his email eventually. Very hard to get his email.
Okay.
Yeah, he's very interested in AI for science, but didn't want to fund this.
Okay. Maybe we
I've
should look for
been
someone
campaigning in Europe for a CERN for AI and science. I want a central facility with maybe hubs in different countries, which would enable Europe to compete with the US and China and have strategic sovereignty in science and technology. They provide a central facility, hub for research and innovation for AI for science. It would have developed large language models, foundation models, and in the same site would have laboratory automation at scale. There's nowhere in the world has this at the moment. So it would allow Europe to leapfrog America and China at AI for science, I believe. And yes, there's an analogy with games. So in chess and Go, I would argue there's a continuum of ability from novices up to grandmasters. And computers or AI systems have followed that path. I remember when chess systems on the computers were very stupid. Now my mobile phone can beat the world champion at chess. And this was driven by improved software and especially improved hardware. And I think this continuum ability between novices and grandmasters is true in science as well, I would argue. So it's true from the simple forms of science which Adam and Eve can do, up through what you and I can do, up to the grandmasters of science, the type of science that Newton and Einstein did. So if you accept that there's this continuum of ability in science, then I would argue that, just like in chess and Go, that improved hardware and software will drive the development of ever smarter robot scientists. And about 10 years ago, the physics Nobel Prize winner Frank Wilczewicz said that in 100 years' time, the best physicist will be a machine. And I'm pretty sure he meant the best scientist will be a machine at that point. So on this front, I've been involved in a thing called the Nobel Turing Challenge. This is the kickoff meeting in 2020 in London, just before the pandemic. And the goal of the Nobel Turing Challenge is by the year 2050 to build an AI robotic system able to do Nobel Prize quality science. And during the pandemic, I thought the probability of that happening was decreasing by 2050, but now with the sudden rise of large language models and foundation models, I think the probability has gone up quite a lot. And if you could make a machine that did Nobel built a machine that could do Nobel Prize quality science, and you could build 10 machines, 100 machines, a million machines, and that would transform the world, I would argue. Okay, to finish, I'd like to thank many collaborators over the year, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really, really interesting. If you can raise your hand if you want to ask anything, then feel free to, unless you do. First, maybe I would like to ask what is your current personal bet on the 2050 challenge? That at what time do you think we will achieve?
I don't know. I think it's at least 10 years. Maybe 20. I think we'll do it though.
Okay. And what do you think about there's a lot of hype around the intelligence explosion. That's when we do specifically AI scientists to do AI science, then it can develop AI itself better, and then it is developing the possibility to build intelligence, and that will be spreading out. And some of these people who in OpenAI and Anthropic and these kind of things put this within the range of 5 to 10 years that we will get there. You would put there in the same basket with the nobody, no intelligence.
I suppose there's two things here. One is it's not clear to me whether you need to be sort of general AI to do science. I remember people used to think that to play world-class chess, you needed to solve AI. And it turned out that there was just, there's machine hacks you can do that solve that problem, which are not to do with general intelligence. I don't know whether science is like that or whether it's not. I'm not really sure. Yes, people are trying to use AI to improve AI. I haven't seen any really clever ideas which are automatically being generated by a system yet in AI. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what the Japanese came up with, the AI scientists, so that they're specifically using the language models to create new research experiments within the domain of machine learning.
Yeah, I've seen, within science generally, and that some science is quite reasonable. But it's not as good as the best humans I've seen anything like.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Danny? Danny, can you turn on your mic, or can I turn it on for you? Hello, mic and allow camera.
Hello, thank you very
Hello,
much.
Noe. Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, I couldn't unmute myself, but thank you for unmuting me. It was a really nice talk. Thank you very much for the talk. And I have one specific question regarding the autonomous robot scientist. That how much is autonomy is considered? So as I understand, for example, the robot, at least at this point, needs some kind of supervision. And if so, does it consider to be the robot's contribution, or it's the contribution of the scientist who supervises the robot or the agent?
Well, it's not really. Well, it's set up. So the problem is, you need to work in this particular area, and that's the background knowledge is given, and it's the type of experiments that can be done are sort of hardwired in. But it's not supervised, so there's no intellectual human input. So the robot has to be looked after as a physical device, needs to be cleaned and things like this, but it's not The intellectual work is done by the machine.
What I mean is more like the task, what it needs to achieve in a way at this point at least should be given or not.
Yes, that's done. So we've got just like in self-driving cars, there's different levels of autonomy. There is. You can imagine a system which can then it can then find its own problems and things like this. And people have done some things a bit similar to that in paper writing, give it all this data, just write some papers about that data. But we're still a long way from really getting the systems to decide on what novel areas of science to look at. It's a bit like, when you're doing your PhD, you start off, your supervisor tells you what to do in some sense. You're given some sort of structure, and more you take control of or new ideas and things. And it's still a long way from doing that. But when it's working, there is no human supervision.
Okay, so thank you. So the aim is to get there, and then we are somewhere halfway.
Yeah, of course, there has to be some control, though. We don't, and we want to make it sure it works in areas which we think are benefit to humankind and things like that.
And would you use LLMs to this kind of hypothesis generation domain, or
yes?
not there?
So we have a paper coming out soon on doing that. There's relatively few. There's a lot of hype in this space, but there's actually relatively little work of using LLMs to actually control any wet biology and have some wet data. There was a big fuss from the Google paper that came out, but when you looked at how many experiments they'd actually done in the wet lab, it was surprisingly small. So partly because it's expensive, at least for us, it was expensive. We spent £50,000 doing the experiments and on cancer drugs. It's quite expensive to do these things in the real world.
So you're going to use these to formulate the hypothesis and then
hallucinations are not a problem in hypothesis generation, because that's the whole point. When you do an experiment, the nature tells you whether the idea is correct or not. That's so.
How do you think how much this is generalizable, this kind of approach that you're using this for the biological sciences and maybe physics? Do you think this can be generalizable for social sciences or human sciences, psychology, these kind of domains as well?
Yes, there is people doing that. Forgotten the guy's name in Germany. I was involved in a review of doing work in the social sciences as well. Yes, so it's the computer's doing psychology experiments with people online and things. It's interesting.
Wow.
Instead of yeast, it's the humans.
Well, okay. We had another question. What technological factors are the most limiting for laboratory automation? Which ones can be eliminated in the near future?
Well, laboratory automation is mostly engineering, so it's a matter of actually one of the things I didn't say was that laboratory automation is actually mostly a European industry. So the robots that you find in wet labs are, in general, made in Europe, especially in South Germany, Switzerland, and parts of Britain. Yeah. So it's one of the reasons I also want these companies are small, medium-sized companies mostly, and I'm worried that they're going to be taken over by, I don't know, big American tech or something, because these companies are mostly hardware companies and their software is often very bad, and not integrated with AI at all. So and that's been the situation for a long time. They don't want their machines necessarily to speak to other machines. There's like technical issues of getting them to speak together and things like this, which are the ones that you think would be simple to solve, but it's more like the economics and sociology of the companies, making things work together. But there is a thing called cloud automation, which has been sort of building steam for the last 10 years. And the idea is that you put all your lab robots together in one site and integrate them tightly together. And that saves on capital costs and running costs. And Carnegie Mellon is the first university in the world to have the lab automation together in a central site and a cloud automation. I think that's the
Right.
future for universities and companies.
And how specialized are they? So do you think that these are going to be more generalizable? These kind of, so if we would invest in building an automated laboratory, that would have to be a very specific for yeast, and then another one for brain cells, and then another one for physics, or do you think these can be more generalizable in the future?
Well, the biology ones are quite, generalizable. The physics ones are quite, obviously the physics equipment is different from the biology ones. And actually the space where most work is actually going is material science. So it's, there is such a big gap between solid state physics and what actually happens when you make a material of, that they, instead of using theory, they do lots of experiments, and machines are quite good at exploring such basics. So if you want to make a new battery material or something, it's, you can get machines to explore that space very efficiently.
And what was the next, as the last question, maybe what's your next thing that you're looking into that is, do you think, most exciting in the near future that could be either a breakthrough or a big hit in this domain?
Well, I'm interested in integrating logic with large language models to this hybrid ideas. I think it's amazing to me that people have forgotten the history of AI, and that these ideas are somehow assumed to be useless and dead, just like they assumed neural networks were useless and dead for 20 years. It's like, it's a strange mistake. And it's the people that are in power now, are just forgotten these ideas. I think we know how. I see them trying to hack large language models to do reasoning. It seems insane to me.
All right.
Terrible waste of money. Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Okay.
coming. Time is up. I hope we can invite you someday in person as well to give us some lectures and potentially collaborate. And in the meantime, we will follow your work, definitely. So thanks again for this fantastic
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
presentation.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.